Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very, very, very good afternoon to each and everyone out there. Hoping everyone is well. Welcome to another session of the Voice of the Cape Matric Revision Program. Our matriculants have recently, I think on Monday, started with the mock examinations. So we wish them well, firstly, and we still encourage them to continue with the studies and, go into old examination papers and listen to matric revision programs like this one in particular as well, if we can say it in that way. Well, we are live on the Voice of the Cape Facebook and YouTube pages, and today in our matric revision program we are discussing a subject that is close to my heart. I love the subject to bits, that is history. For our matriculants, our matric class of 2022, and we are joined with Danielle Pretorius. She is the senior tutor of the Futures Academy. So, without any further ado, I hand the mic over to Danielle Pretorius. Firstly, Danielle, good afternoon, and how are you?
Hi, thank you. I'm very well. How are you? We're just hoping that all the matrics are here today and joining us from wherever they are to just take part in today's class. I think it's going to be very exciting.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. Well, Danielle, not to take any more of your time, I hand over to you. So, yeah, enlighten us in the history for our matric class of 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, hi, matrics. I am a teacher at Futures Academy, which is an online-based high school, um, and I teach the history section. So, what I would think would be the best to start off with, just getting right into it, is the basics of the paper. So, before you even start writing your history paper, there's preparation that you need to do. And we'll get to that just now. But essentially, when it comes to history, you will be writing two papers, and these papers will be 3 hours, and each paper will have a total of 150 marks. Okay, now it's important to note the following because I see a lot of students just answer the whole question paper and don't actually read the instructions in the beginning, especially with history. It's extremely important. Okay, so section A of your paper consists of 3 source-based questions. Candidates will be required to answer at least 1 source-based question in each question paper. Then section B consists of 3 essay questions, and you will be required to answer at least 1 essay question in each of the question papers. So basically what that means is you will have to answer 3 questions in total. 1 source-based, 1 essay, and then the third question you can pick if you want to write source-based or an essay question. They tell us that the essay and source-based questions carry 50 marks each, and the total for the whole question paper is 150. So that means that you will be writing essentially that there's 3 sections, and each section will count 50 marks. Okay, please do not go through the whole paper and try answer all the sections. You won't have time to answer 6 questions, 3 source-based and 3 essay. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to answer 1 source-based, 1 essay question, and then either or for the third one. So don't go and do the whole question paper. You won't have time. And when it comes to marking, we can only say, for example, if you chose 2 source-based questions, I can only mark a maximum of 2 source-based and a maximum of 1 essay then. So it comes to the point where if you've written so much and you've answered every section, I can only give you marks up until a certain amount. So make sure that you follow the structure of the paper to a T. Then, besides just general structuring of the paper, there's also the scope for paper 1 and paper 2. And this scope should be the same for all students because we are writing the National Senior Certificate Examinations, and those are across the board the same. So all matrics will be writing on the same scope. And for that, you can check the History Grade 12 exam guidelines. They're on the Western Cape Education Department website, but I will pull them up now. So this is just the first section that we just went through now of the structure of the examination paper. And then this is the prescribed topics for 2021 to 2023. And this is important because the nice thing about history that makes it different from other subjects as well is when it comes to the end of the year, you don't have to study all the work, okay? You know that your section A source-based in paper 1, the first question will be on the Cold War, the second question will be on independent Africa, and the third question will be on civil society protests from the 1950s to 1970s. Okay, and then they tell us this is the section B essay questions for paper 1. So we have the extension of the Cold War, which is the Vietnam case study, then also independent Africa, and then again the civil society protests from 1950s to 1970s, but focusing on the second section of the work. So the first section would be the US civil rights movement, and the second section would be the Black Power movement. From this, you are going to say then, okay, I need to answer 3 questions. One of them needs to be a source-based, one of them needs to be an essay, and the other one can be either or. Okay, then you go through this work and you choose which topics you would like to do. And you go and study those topics. Because oftentimes what we'll find is that students don't look at this or the scope for the paper. Here's the paper 2 scope as well. And they try just study everything for paper 1 and paper 2. That's not how it should be, okay? So you should be focusing on specifically what is going to be covered in that paper, and then even more specifically, which questions you would feel the most comfortable with answering and which you would be able to score the highest amounts of marks on, because that's basically what it comes down to at the end of the day. Okay, so we have this section here for paper 1, which we will insert here. And then for paper 2, the same thing in terms of the structure, but obviously the content that you will be revising will change. Okay, so here is the first scope, and then we'll get to the second scope for paper 2. So this one is for paper 1, and the next one will be for paper 2. Okay, so we looked at the paper 1 section, and we'll go through this in a bit more depth just now, just covering the overall general guidelines first, and then we'll obviously get into more depth, also going over the topics. Yeah. Okay, so in paper 2, this is where we get to kind of the South African section. And then also you'll remember that the last section in the grade 12 work would be the new world order that emerged after the Cold War and that whole idea of globalization. Okay, so same here for essay and contextual. We have civil resistance, 1970s to 1980s, South Africa. And then number 2, we have the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. And the question focus here is the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Then thirdly, the end of the Cold War and a new world order, 1989 to the present. And the question focus here is the new world order. While on the essay section, it is the impact of Gorbachev's reforms on the Soviet Union and South Africa. Then for the other 2 options you can pick for the essay question would be civil resistance again in South Africa, but the question focus would be the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state. And then the coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past, that would be the negotiated settlement and the government of national unity. So kind of essay on the negotiations, if you could think about it like that. Okay, so we have this one as well. And then we'll look at each of the topics a bit more in depth now. But what I also wanted to say is that oftentimes what I will recommend for students is to do, depending on what you're comfortable with, obviously, and this will differ from individual student to individual student, but a lot of times students will spend the most amount of time in their paper on their essay. And so you can imagine if you were doing 2 essays and 1 contextual rather than 2 contextuals and 1 essay, oftentimes students will end up spending a lot more time and will sometimes find it unable to finish the question paper. Because previously, up until now, most of the time in term 2, you only had to answer 2 questions in the question paper, yet now you are answering 3 and you have 3 hours. So what you want to do is you kind of want to give yourself an hour for each. So for each section, try give yourself an hour. If you know that you specifically struggle with essays, then do not try to write 2 essays. Rather try to do the contextual if you know that's your strong point. And that's really why past paper revision is also so important. It's because it allows you to identify your strengths and weaknesses in just general answering of history. Because naturally, some people will find it easier to do the contextual in comparison to the essay and vice versa. So really spend time doing a past paper, time yourself, see if you will be able to finish the paper in time, and then see which one is the easiest for you. Is it contextual or is it the essay? Okay. And then let's just go through the rest of these guidelines. We're going to get to this now because I feel like a very good thing to learn in general, and that I feel that a lot of people lack, is in history, you need to have analytical skills. You need to be able to explain things on a higher level. So, for example, if there's a 1 mark question, you would have to say less than what you would for a 4 mark question, right? So those higher order questions have specific ways that you sometimes answer them. For example, it would be things like this: comment on the usefulness or reliability of the information, compare the evidence and explain how you would account for the differences, and explain to what extent the evidence in source A can be seen as like biased or unbiased. Okay, so any questions that aren't just quote 2 reasons from the source. What does the information in the source tell you about this? A little bit more higher level, those require more analysis, and that is where we often see that students will start losing their marks. Okay, so it would be helpful to also read through this. We're going to go through the just general how to answer source-based questions, how to answer your paragraph questions, and how to answer your essay questions. Because I noticed that across the board, there's generally a lack of consensus on how you generally answer these types of questions, because they have a structure that you would follow, right? If something says, how reliable is this source, you would have to know the indicators of reliability in the source and then explain them with examples from that specific source. So you would have to know what makes a source reliable, what makes a source useful, what makes a source unreliable. Okay, and then we'll get to this as well when we start talking about the essay questions. And then the last thing I want you to note in the exam guideline is this: how is your essay marked? Because I think a lot of times, if you actually have the mark sheet with you and you see how teachers are actually marking your essay, you'll realize why you start to lose marks. Okay, so there are 2 main things that you get marks for in your essay. The first one is your presentation, so how you structured it. Did you write in full sentences? Did you write in paragraphs? Everything isn't just one chunk of information. Did you provide an introduction? Did you provide a conclusion? And then content, which actually assesses the actual meat of your essay. That's where you get marks for your facts. What I want you to note here is that even if like which generally doesn't tend to happen, your presentation is very low, but your content is very high. Here, I still cannot give you a mark for high content if your presentation is low. So if you get level 1 for presentation, your marks will automatically fall into this block. If you get level 2, it'll go from this block, right? So you have to make sure that there's kind of congruency between your presentation and your content in order to be able to get higher scoring marks. So what you want to look at is around from level 5 upwards, the criteria to scoring high from level 5 upwards. I would say that is generally a good mark for an essay is from, let's say, here, 35 to 50. Okay, so now that we've looked at the general exam guidelines and we've put down a scope for both papers, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we generally answer questions. So even if you didn't have any information on the Cold War or on independent Africa, how would you answer those types of questions? So this doesn't for this specific work that we're doing today, because we're doing like a general covering, and then we'll be going into depth more like topic specifically. So you don't need the topic context to be able to understand how to answer any type of history essay, because I feel like that is even more worthwhile doing, because it equips you with writing skills and also like just general analytical and answering skills, which you need to be able to score high in a paper like this. Okay, so let's look at how to write a history. Let's say, okay, I can't find that document now. Give me 1 second. And then we will take from here. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at is, if you want to break down a paper, it consists of your contextual, then your paragraph, and then your essay question. So you need to be able to answer source-based questions, you need to be able to write a paragraph, and you need to be able to write an essay. Okay. So it says here how to answer short answer questions, source-based vibes. So if this basically just refers to the lower level source-based questions. So the questions that count like 1 or 2 marks. And remember, we just looked at the levels, which was also indicated in the examination guidelines. Okay, so when you're answering short answer questions, most of the time the answer comes from the source. So what you want to do is you want to look at the mark allocation after you've read the question. This mark allocation will generally tell you how much you need to write to get the correct answer. So if it is written 2 times 1, that means you have to give 2 facts for 2 marks. If it's 1 times 2, that means you have to give 1 fact for 2 marks. Okay, so do you see how it works out? The first number generally indicates how many actual facts you should write. Before you answer any of the questions, read all the sources first in the section. So what I mean by in the section is read all the sources in, say, for example, if you're doing the section on civil resistance in South Africa or in the 1980s, then don't go and read the sources about the Cold War. Like, that isn't going to help you. Read the relevant sources that they give to you. Then you read the source in detail that pertains to the question. So, for example, if the question says, read source A and answer the following, then you go and you read source A again. And then we establish context. We look at where the source is from. What does that mean? When I say you're establishing context, is you're trying to basically build a little picture and idea around the source. Kind of try to think of it as the environment in which the source lives or like existed. So, for example, if the source was a newspaper article about the Soweto uprising, then look at the pictures and really read that and try place yourself in that part of history and supplement what you're reading in the source with the information that you've studied before you started writing the test. So look at things like the environment, how people felt, when the source was written, and the general atmosphere around the event or problem. Okay, and then it says, when you're answering the question, look at what is being asked. Then answer what is being asked, and if you can, say why. That's really important. We'll get to the Peel method now as well, but it basically just stands for giving your point, explaining your point, giving an example, and then linking the point back to what you were talking about in the first place. And when I say look for answers in the source, is firstly, when they give you a question, look if there's a straightforward answer. So look if there's a straightforward answer in the source. If not, is there a clue in the source that can tell you half of the answer? Supplement with your own knowledge. So what's really important as well is don't think that in a source based you can get away with not studying because it's based on the source. You need to have that higher level of understanding, which will only come from properly going through the content and actively engaging with it. Watch videos on what you're studying, try relate it back to what's going on today, because I think that's actually such a nice part of history as a subject, is that it explains a lot of the things that are happening in our environment today. And if you can make those critical connotations, then you're already halfway there in answering those higher order questions. Okay, and then we get to the higher order questions that I was just mentioning. Note, these higher order questions are in the short answer section, so in the source-based. And these are often questions like, is this relevant or reliable? How do we know if the source is credible? Is the source useful or not? Okay. So, like I said before, if they ask you questions like this, you will have to know certain indicators of reliability, credibility, and usefulness. Okay. So, what makes a source reliable? Let me do an extra one here. Okay. So how do we know if a source is credible? Let's say if a source is reliable. Okay, so firstly, who has written the source? So, and when? Was it someone who was part of the event, or is it just someone retelling the story? For example, if the source was words of a president, it would be considered more reliable than just a normal person off the street. Or, for example, when something about history is written many years later, its accuracy comes into question. So is it a first-hand account? Is it a second-hand account? Those types of things as well. So who has written the source and when? Then, is the source biased? Okay, so what does it mean if the source is biased? It means that the source seems to be favoring the one side more than the other. It fails to stay neutral. So you would say that a source which favors, or which is written from or written by a US journalist about the Cold War could be less reliable, the same way you would question information that was solely written by the Soviets in the Cold War. Okay, so if it seems to be leaning more towards one side and painting one side as like a much nicer picture than the other side, that's usually an indication that a source can be biased as well. And then, as I mentioned here, in who has written the source and when, is it a first-hand account? Is it written or orally recorded? Okay, so a first-hand account means someone who witnessed it recorded the source. And the second-hand account means someone just gathered information and wrote. Okay, and then is it written or orally recorded? So what it means by that is that in a lot of times you have to remember that when things are orally recorded, they get passed down in terms of speech. And oftentimes through like generations, the words can become twisted. So something written is sometimes more considered more like reliable, but yeah, we should also be careful about thinking about history as too European, because it is a very big tradition in African cultures to orally record their history. And that doesn't mean that their history is necessarily irrelevant or uncredible, if that makes sense. Okay, then what makes a source relevant? So if they say like, critically examine the relevancy of the source. Or, for example, if you are a historian studying this topic, how helpful or how relevant would this source be? So, does it deal with the topic that you are working on? Does it describe the topic correctly? The history is unbiased. And how important is the source to the work? How much information does it give you about the work? For example, in this case, coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past. So if you were to read and read minutes from TRC meetings, you would say that those are quite relevant if you were looking at the coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past, because the TRC was a very big and relevant part of how South Africa decided to come to terms with the past. Whether it was as effective or not, that is very much up to debate. But does the source deal with what's part of the work? Okay, so in comparison, if you were looking at the coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past, and the source was about like religious extremism, then you would say the source isn't very relevant because it's not giving me any information about the specific topic that I'm working on. Okay, I'm going to remove this because I feel like it will confuse some people. Okay, so how do we know if a source is useful? If they ask you things like this, remember you have to say yes or no. So yes, is it useful or not? And then secondly, you need to say why. Even if you just say yes, I'm like, you won't get all the marks. You get the marks because of your why. Okay, so you need to like there's a kind of a criteria that you can use almost. Okay, so how much? So if, let's say the source is useful, and then we look at the criteria of how much information does it give us about the topic and the environment at the time. So let's say the source is a newspaper extract from the 1980s during apartheid. Okay, how much information does it give us about the topic and the environment at the time? Let's say it gives us a lot of information about the topic of apartheid and the environment that was created in the 1980s, and then you give an example of the type of environment that was displayed in the source. Okay, how credible is it? Who wrote it? So, for example, if it was written by the NP government, you wouldn't think it's very credible. But if it was written by an independent news source, it would be a bit more credible. How useful is it to the aim of the person and why? And that's just oftentimes in history, they will say, imagine you are an historian and you are studying this. Would this source be useful for you? So put yourself in the person's shoes. So you are a historian studying the changes in apartheid during the 1980s. Do you think this source is useful to you or not? Say why. Okay, so that's an example of a type of question you would get. What you want to do is you want to refer to the general idea of the text. And then I did three examples here. So, for example, the source is useful as it explains the environment at the time and then give an example and is a first-hand account written from a historian's perspective, if that is the case. Or the source is not useful as the image is propaganda and does not accurately describe the time period at all, if the source is a picture. Or you can say it is useful since it gives us insight to the different points of view people had about the issue at the time. However, it can be seen as biased and more information needs to be consulted with it to ensure a more whole approach. Can you see that in the first part, I say the source is useful and I say the source is not useful. So you have to say which side you're choosing, and then substantiate that. And remember to tie back what you're substantiating to the actual work that you're doing. So if you just go, the source is useful as it explains the environment at the time and is a first-hand account, then you probably only get 1 mark because you're not being specific enough. It explains the environment at the time. What environment at the time? Okay, give us the example. The first-hand account written from a historian's perspective is if we think about the, let's say, the NP article that we were talking about a bit earlier. You could say the source isn't useful as the image is propaganda and does not accurately describe the time period at all. For example, this newspaper says this and this and this happened, but actually due to history textbooks and multiple accounts from historians, we know, and pictures, we know that this and this and this actually happened. Okay. And then answering in paragraph form, and this is those, it's like generally counts 8 marks, and it is at the end of every source-based section. So it's at the end of every source-based section, and it tends to count around 8 marks. Okay, so what I want you guys to remember here as well is to be mindful of the time. If you are someone that struggles with finishing your history essay, look at the time, because a lot of times I will see students prep for the paragraph form as if it's their essay and then waste so much time trying to figure that out that they don't finish their essay. So what I like to think about a little paragraph form is like a mini, very, very condensed essay. And you'll see that the steps to doing it is also kind of just like a condensed form of the steps of an essay. Okay, so firstly, you want to jot down the 7, 8, or 9 main facts or ideas you want to cover in the paragraph. Let's take an example from last year's past paper. Let's do the paper 1 while we're at it. So you'll see here's the source-based section that we were talking about, source-based section, and then here's your 8 marks, see? Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining how the Marshall Plan intensified Cold War tensions between the USA and the USSR from 1947. Again, another one here. On the Angolan Civil War, so why foreign powers became involved in the Angolan Civil War between 1974 and 1976. Again, another one here, which just deals with the civil society protests in America at the time. Okay, so let's say this is the topic. I'm going to show you guys how I would recommend just the steps to answering a paragraph question. Okay, so they tell us that they want us to write a paragraph of about 8 lines, 80 words. Don't go on the lines, go on the words. You can write up to 100. But remember, the longer it also is, don't make it too long because you still get marked for keeping it in a paragraph form. And then be mindful of your time. Firstly, you want to jot down the 7, 8, or 9 facts or ideas that you want to cover in the paragraph. Okay, so we'll look at the question and then we identify the topic that it is covering that we studied. Okay, so sit-ins contributed to the desegregation of public facilities in the United States of America during the 1960s. Okay, when we think about the US in the 1960s, we should be thinking about the civil rights movements. Okay, so they tell us we have to explain how different forms of sit-ins contributed to the desegregation of public facilities in the United States of America during the 1960s. Okay, so then you start thinking about ideas that come to mind when you look at something like this. Okay, so firstly, the examples of the sit-ins. because they tell us that there were various forms that they want us to talk about. For example, where they sat in Woolworths, the Montgomery bus boycott, where they started hosting sit-ins at universities and giving talks. Okay, so just stuff that comes to mind when you think about the sit-ins. And then, so why desegregation? And why did the sit-ins work? So they put pressure on the government. Could also say that businesses started realizing it was unprofitable, and due to wide civilian outlash. Okay, so now I basically already just wrote down anything that came to mind when I think about the sit-ins, and now I have something to work with to write. Then I arrange them into chronological order, and only then will you start writing your paragraph. Then you will very shortly introduce the topic in a sentence or less. Actually, just a sentence. You can't really do less than that. So conversely, where in an essay, your introduction should be a whole paragraph, here it's generally a line. So, for example, the 1700s was a very unsure time for people of color in the Cape, or the 1960s and 70s was an uncertain time in America as opposition towards racist laws took on a more aggressive stance. Let's just say here, instead of aggressive stance, because that would be the Black Power section, the opposition to racist laws became a civil rights revolution. Then you will very shortly explain your points. And then in the end, you will summarize everything you spoke about in one sentence. And then you will end off with a statement. And the statement that you usually start and end off with should tie to the kind of the title or like what it's supposed to be about. So this one is how sit-ins contributed to the desegregation of public facilities during the 1960s. So for example, if you end up with a statement, it would be something like, because of these reasons, the different forms of sit-ins contributed to the desegregation of public facilities in the US during the 1960s. So summarizing it and linking that point back to it.
Danielle, I'm not sure if are you with me? Can you
Yes,
hear
I'm
me?
still with you.
Unfortunately, our time has run out for today. I know
Oh
there's
my
so much
goodness.
more that has to be done, but we need to break. Um, I'm sure we will be back again with you maybe next week or so. I will sort that out for you. But once again, thank you so much for joining us, man. We'll continue. I think maybe Friday we can work out something.
Awesome. I will be in touch. Thank you so much. It was such a lovely session.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Keep well. That was Danielle Pretorius, the head at Futures History, tutoring us in the history subject. We thank you so much. And to our matriculants, all the best for the examination.
Thank you.